Hi, thank you for being with us today. I'm Teresa Bruno, the host of the Soul Talks podcast, where we share survival stories to help us all find courage and hope to heal. We're here to get today again with Dr. Katie Eastman. She's just absolutely amazing, and I'm having the time of my life getting to talk to her. And if you'll remember last week, she left us with the story of Jason, and I couldn't stop crying. Her very first patient as a 24-year-old social worker. Hi, Dr. Eastman. So happy to see you again today.
Oh, it's lovely to be here.
I'm sure you're going to make me cry again.
Uh, well, tears are a reflection of how much you've loved.
Uh, I'll take that. I say that a lot about my late husband, but we'll get to that in a minute. I did want to pick up your life. So we got just a snapshot into this young, very feisty, very courageous, and I want to say, really innovative, what you did with Jason and kind of becoming his agent, and that kept him alive probably much longer than he would have lived.
Mm-hmm.
So you were 24. Can you take us through what happens after 24 to become a master grief coach, psychotherapist, organizational coach that deals with all kinds of issues around transformation, companies needing courage? How did you get from there to all these things that you do?
I would have to say that belongs to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the woman who wrote The 5 Stages of Grief that everyone has heard of, became my mentor. And Elizabeth was the one who taught me the most about grief is highly personal. It doesn't follow any particular pathway. Everyone is unique, and that grief never ends.
That is such a true statement. In my situation, as you know, my husband committed suicide. We're right at the 5-year mark. And from the early stages, people would come up to me and they would say, "Oh my gosh, you're going through this. You've been in this 6 months. You've been in this a year. And this has just happened to me. How long will my pain last?"
Mm.
Well, I was asking myself the same question because I wanted out so badly from all of the pain and the grief and the sorrow. But one of the things I really learned, you know, just walking it, was that grief doesn't end. You kind of learn to hold it, in one hand. You learn
Mhm. Mhm.
to eat with it and sleep with it and brush your
Mhm.
teeth with it and go to
Mhm.
bed with it
Yeah.
while you're still trying to do life,
Right.
you know,
Right.
over here.
Right.
And it's a very true statement, and here I am 5 years later and still grieving,
Mhm.
still living and rebuilding
Mhm.
my life and rewriting
Mhm.
my story. But
Mhm.
that grief has not ended.
I have a dear friend whose son died, and he was 8. And she said that grief became her friend. She would
Hmm.
welcome it in whenever she does welcome it in. She welcomes it in like a friendly neighbor that comes to the door. She allows it to be there to do whatever it needs to do to help her feel whatever she needs to feel, to deal with whatever's coming up at the moment. And then she lets it go until it comes back again. So I always think of grief as something that revisits throughout our lives, because we don't go from loving someone for a number of years and then forgetting
Hmm.
them, or
No.
or I mean, we hurt every time they come back into our memories or our thoughts, and there's nothing wrong with that, because that is our healthy way of being human and embracing how much we loved, and and
Oh
and
gosh.
and we're entering back into that loving relationship every time we revisit it. So there's nothing unhealthy about grief revisiting.
That's beautiful. But keep telling me about how you went from being a social worker
Oh,
to
Elizabeth.
being a master grief coach, Dr.
Yes.
Yeah, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
So she was the one that introduced me to that idea. And then I started reading everything that she was writing. I started following her, and I started recognizing in myself a gift that I was given in the ability to sit with other people's pain. And so as I learned more about myself, my own losses, And I went through infertility. I went through all kinds of different, I went through divorce. As I learned about my own losses, I evolved into a much better therapist, coach, master grief coach because of the number of years that I had done it. And I started developing my own recreate model. I started seeing patterns. And one of the things I learned is that people need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I learned that from Elizabeth. She used to say, and I won't use her language, but she used to say, we all need to deal with she called it fertilizer, what our losses are, and those inform how we live our lives. And so I became,
I feel like I'm just in loss after loss after loss right now.
yeah. And a lot
But
of
it
people,
certainly informs. It
yes,
certainly informs
it
how I
can.
live.
Yes.
It
Yes.
aligns me with my true
Yes. Your values.
values,
Yep.
spiritual path.
Yep.
It aligns me with my purpose, as we've talked so much about,
Right.
especially with
Right.
Sweet Jason.
Right.
So, I mean, I just love the story you told last week as a little girl, and your daddy,
Mhm.
the homeless person on the bench, and you're saying to your dad, well, that was his home. That
Mhm.
is his home.
Mhm.
And what I see in that is this child who already had incredible intuition,
Mhm.
empathy,
Yes.
but already carrying almost a sorrow for those who grieve.
Yes. Yes. And when I realized in graduate school, I went to seminary. I went to where Martin
Mm,
Luther King had gone to seminary purposely because I
mhm.
felt like, oh, where can I go where I can just really be this person who lifts people up and advocates, and social justice was such a part of my life. And so I went to that seminary, and it was there I realized I needed more. I needed spiritual direction, I needed psychology direction, and I needed to put them together. So then I went on and got my
Mm.
doctorate. I told Jason's story in my dissertation, and I realized then that I needed to create a program to help as many people as I could deal with the death of a child, because nobody wants to talk about the death of a child. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been told to not say that. And
Well, nobody wants to talk about death in
nobody
our
wants to talk
culture.
about death.
We
No,
have no
no,
language for death, and
no.
we certainly don't have a language or allow time and space for grieving.
Right,
We're supposed to be,
right,
okay, funeral's done, you got a couple
right,
days off from work, you're back to work, and you're supposed to be performing in
right,
max 2 weeks,
right,
right?
right.
And then truly nobody wants to talk about, I'm 5 years in and it still hurts like hell. And there are days
Yes,
it's really hard to get out of the bed.
of course.
And people
Yeah.
will go, 5 years, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get over it?
Mm,
It doesn't work like that, but we
no,
really don't know how to
no.
talk about it or make space for it.
Right, right. It's people are just genuinely uncomfortable being uncomfortable. And unfortunately, because what is twisted about that is it's only when you're vulnerable and uncomfortable that your body, your mind, your spirit, and your emotions can send you the message about what you need. So if we don't allow grief to come in, and I'm talking every single day, in my book, I talk about we have tangible loss and we have intangible losses every day. COVID's a
Mhm.
perfect example. We lost our sense of safety, stability, security. Those are all
Mhm.
intangible losses, but they were losses. Now, people who made it through COVID doing better on the other end were the ones that dug in and said, okay, this really hurts, but why? This is
Mhm.
uncomfortable, but why? What am I going to do
Mhm.
about it? And that's where I wrote the book from, is because I realized there's this path that I watched these resilient folks go through unimaginable loss, lift themselves up, and take that
Mm.
pain and give back to others. And
Yeah,
so I
beautiful.
realized in that moment that that's kind of what my life purpose was all about, was this message that Kubler-Ross understood, Jason understood, Austin understood. And my job to keep telling that story, which is your pain is your superpower.
I've never thought of it that way. That's a great line. I want to lead this podcast when your pain is your
It's your
superpower.
superpower. Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I
It
want to stay
is.
on that path for a minute, but I have to ask, like, it just, yes, I hear you say you had losses. You had what you might have interpreted as failures. You had a fertility journey. And I know I'm going through it with a friend now. It's raw, it's grueling. It can be,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the best thing in the world and the most heartbreaking thing. You had a divorce. Was there a moment where, I mean, but it also sounds like, your trajectory with your purpose, with being a master grief coach, just always seemed to be an upward trajectory.
Absolutely. Yes, because
Was there
I
a
made peace
pivot
with
point?
loss. I made
Oh,
peace with
wow.
loss.
You made peace with
Loss
loss.
became my power. I realized my infertility was a gift when first of all, when I adopted my daughter, and I realized I never would have
Hmm.
gotten her had I had a biological child. But also important was I realized that I could sit with moms who were losing their children because I had had my own experience of physical loss of a child. It wasn't the
Right.
same. It was not as intense, but I had an empathy for them that
Yeah.
allowed me to be there. So I took my pain and I transformed it into why I'm here.
Which is exactly what you teach. It's
Yes.
exactly what you coach.
Yeah.
So I want to invite you into my life right now,
Okay.
vulnerably, and I
Mhm.
will cry. Um, and ask you to do what you do.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned earlier, my beloved husband of 29 years, best, kindest man I have ever been exposed to, took his life 5 years ago, just a month into COVID. So, if I came to you and I said, Dr. Eastman, you're a master grief coach,
Mhm.
how would you coach me?
Well, the first thing I would say to you is suicide loss is something that you will experience your entire life.
Mm,
It is complex in that, and all grief is complex, but suicide loss has its own issues. So there are issues of survivor guilt sometimes.
sure.
There are issues of focusing on how they died instead of how they lived. There
Yeah,
are issues of stigma of other people who tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing or thinking, or you should be over this by
absolutely.
now, which is super easy for somebody to say who's never been through it. And there is a lot of why.
Yeah.
And I would also tell you that why will never be answered.
Nope. It
There
will
is
never
never a
be answered.
satisfactory answer to that.
Mm-mm.
And what I say to people is suicide is a perfect storm of circumstance, um, opportunity, and pain, threshold of
Mm.
pain. And all of them have to come together at the right time. And I always say this to everyone: if you had known, you would have done something, but you didn't know,
Absolutely.
and you couldn't know because they didn't want you to know.
Yeah, and that's all, I always say why we were so close. He
Right,
was my best friend. We did everything
right,
together. He used to say we were peas and carrots.
right,
Why didn't he let me into his pain?
right. And you'll never answer that because that's gone with him. What you will, however, always be able to go to is, what am I going to do about it? Because there
Yeah,
are so many people in the world who have experienced loss, who are getting those same messages from other people telling them they should be over this, they should go
yeah,
on, blah, blah, blah. All the shoulds. I always say, quit
yeah.
shoulding all over yourself. And
You might want to be careful with that
I
pronunciation.
know. And well, that's how I say it purposely, because frankly, what
Yes,
other
I
people
know.
think of you is none of your business, because easy for them to
Yep.
say. But it's more important not what not that you're grieving, but it's how you're grieving. What are you doing to take that pain and make it into something beautiful? Because
Hmm.
you can. You can.
Yeah.
And there are moments when you can't, And there are moments when you simply just need to cry and feel like crap. But there are
Yep.
also moments when you can take it and do what you're doing right now, which is to send a message to others who are going through pain in whatever form, for whatever loss. You can take that pain and transform it into something good. So it's not what happened to you as much as it's what are you doing about it. And so
I hear you.
yeah,
Yeah.
coaching you as a master grief coach is to help you understand for you how you are feeling and experiencing your grief, and you deciding what are you going to do to lift yourself up and move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's important to me for our audience to hear, like in my situation, I've always been very driven. I've been an entrepreneur. I've opened multiple businesses. I've had successes, I've had failures. So my instinct is always to get up and make something good of it. My
Mm-hmm,
instinct is to
mm-hmm,
always be positive, and yet when James died, it was a full year and a half, almost 2 years where all I could make good of
mm-hmm,
was opening the drapes, making my coffee.
mm-hmm,
I went to work because I had a business where employees had to be paid.
mm-hmm,
So I kept working really just to pay them,
mm-hmm,
but I had no heart for it anymore.
mm-hmm,
Business and marketing and fast food and all the things I was representing just was like, are you kidding me?
mm-hmm,
I can't even make sense of this.
mm-hmm.
And I did, there were the little climbs out of,
Right.
okay, I'm standing up straight.
Yeah.
My biggest effort in the first years was, even if I didn't feel that way on the inside, I had 2 boys in their
Mm-hmm,
20s. They just
mm-hmm,
lost their dad.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, you know,
mm-hmm.
to just at least put a face on it for them, that we can still be a family. We can still
Right.
somehow go on. It won't look like it did before. We'll never be that family again. But together we can be something that we're proud of and that he would be proud of.
Yes.
Um, so so yes, those were the things, but I mean it took me a long time. And then, you know, slowly I began to kind of listen to myself and all the, everything that I thought my life stood for before his suicide, running at success and accolades, and, what school our kids went to, and, where we lived, and, the philanthropy we were involved in, those definitions no longer meant anything.
Right. Right.
And
Yes.
so I began to start to rewrite my story, which I'm still very much doing. But I want to say too, for our listeners, especially, and again, it's just where I've come from, but it's not a straight trajectory up.
No. No.
It is a
No.
raw and
Right.
rocky road of, I make a few, I do a little
Mhm,
bit of this and I'm
mhm.
okay, and I think I'm rebuilding, and then I'm back in just the
Right.
depths of it
Yes.
all.
Yes. I call it, the metaphor I use is, if you've ever canoed on a rough day, you go 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Mm,
That's what the trajectory is really like. It's you have ups and you have downs. And what I
yeah.
encourage people to do is ride that wave, because it's a wave. But in all of that, always asking yourself, what's my why?
What's my why? Okay.
Why am I getting
What's
up
my
in the
why?
morning? Right. Why am I getting up in the morning? Why am I important? Why do I
Hmm.
matter? Who needs
Yeah.
me? I very
Yeah.
frequently, when I'm with people who are in the throes of grief and they don't even want to get out of bed in the morning, I say, somebody needs you. And if you're
Mm.
lying in bed, they aren't going to get what they need. Who is
And
that?
Dr. Eastman, I hate it, but we have to close out this section right now.
Okay.
You have been so generous with me, and I just have loved sitting with you today. Thank you for your counsel and for your wisdom. And, somehow every time I listen to one of your podcasts or anything that you're doing, you just emanate joy for life,
Mhm.
even though
Mhm.
what you're dealing with every day is
Right.
grief.
Right. Exactly.
So
And that's my
I,
message. When you're in the
yeah,
depths of despair, your superpower is that pain from that loss transformed into growth.
So I'm very lucky that I get to sit with you next week and get to explore all the huge things that you're doing with Elizabeth Hamilton Guarino and your podcast and your multiple books and all of those things. But for today, just so many thanks. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Eastman. Just amazing. And we'll see you next week and get to hear a lot more about what she's doing currently and her humanitarian efforts. In the meantime, take care and take hope.